So how do you go about creating a forecast? There is a general forecasting process. So the first thing we have to determine is what are we going to do with the information we obtain? What's the purpose of the forecast? And this is really going to inform the next step, which is establishing a forecasting horizon. So remember that if we are making decisions about what to produce, how to produce, how much we're going to produce in terms of capacity, how our facility is going to be laid out, where our location is. These are big strategic decisions that design how we make our good or provide our service. And they are long-term decisions. And so if those are your purposes or what you're going to use your forecast for, then your forecast horizon needs to be longer term. So you're going to need many years of data. The general rule of thumb is you should go as far back as you are going forward. Now, it's always better to go further back than you are going forward, but at a bare minimum, you should go at least as far back in time as you are forecasting forward. So these long-term decisions, remember these are 2 years plus for our forecasting horizon. If our decisions that we're going to make based on these forecasts are for medium-term use of our system, so we're looking at level of inventory, how many employees we should have, then we're going to need some medium-term forecasting horizon and a medium-term technique. So here we're looking at forecasting forward 12 weeks to 2 years. So in this case, we're going to analyze a month's worth of data, and we're going to use a mix of what we call judgmental methods and quantitative methods, and we'll look at what those are in just a second. When you have medium-term forecasting horizons, you're probably also dealing with seasonality. So these are changes that are within a year due to seasonal variations. Maybe you make ice cream and there's more demand for your product in the summer than the winter. And so you have to take that seasonality into consideration as well. We'll talk more about seasonality in a later video. If you're using your forecast for short-term scheduling, then in this case, you need to be able to forecast short term, so less than 12 weeks or so, and you'll use some very simple quantitative methods. And we'll look at some of those simple quantitative methods in just a moment. So we need to figure out what is the purpose of the forecast. That'll inform how long or how far forward we need to forecast, so what's our forecasting horizon. It'll also impact the technique that we use. So we're going to look at those techniques. When we're looking at forecasting techniques, we have judgmental methods and we have quantitative methods. So judgmental methods are when you're doing an analysis of subjective inputs. And these can be from consumers, from your sales staff. This can be from your management, and from your executives, from your experts, etc. So essentially judgmental comes from talking to individuals who know about your product. So some examples would be to get some executive opinions, so talking to your upper management about their strategic plan or the plan for new products. You might have your sales staff give information in terms of what customers want, how much inventory has been moving. You might have consumer surveys, so maybe you've done some marketing research, you've done focus groups on customer satisfaction, what they're looking for in your product, how much of their product they want to buy. You might have questionnaires where you're gathering data from those customers. Okay. You may collect expert opinions. One of those methods for collecting expert opinions is what is called the Delphi method. And we're going to talk about the Delphi method in class and use a class activity to understand how the Delphi method works. So judgmental forecasting is really subjective. It's about talking to people who have the information and getting that information from them. So when would you be most likely to use the judgmental method? Well, you're going to use this judgmental method for new products. For products where you don't have that historical data to look at. So maybe something is different, maybe it's a brand new product, maybe the product has been adapted so that the historical data you don't consider as being a good representation for a future forecast, so it's better to talk to the experts. The benefit of the judgmental method is that you can include information that you otherwise could not. Right? You can get that perspective of the customers or management or sales. The downside, of course, is that because it is subjective and you're getting information from various people, there can be bias and it can be less accurate, especially the further out we go. Because the information you're obtaining is very short term, right? So recollections of people in the last short while, and so it's really only good for a short period of time going forward. So if we're forecasting medium term, we're going to use some judgmental and some quantitative. If we are forecasting long term, so the long horizon, then we get into quantitative methods. We have our trend analysis, we have associative models, and we're going to look at all of those. In the very short term, there are short-term quantitative methods that we're going to look at just momentarily that we'd be most likely to use. So we determine the purpose of our forecast. It helps us establish how far into the future we're going to forecast, our forecasting horizon. That helps us understand which forecasting technique is appropriate. We're then going to gather and analyze any of the data. And then we're going to prepare the forecast. And then our very last step is to monitor that forecast and determine how successful it was. So this is where we're going to look at our forecasting error. So how off were we from reality? And that way we can inform better forecasts in the future. So as we start to look at our forecasting methods, we need to be able to identify some of the patterns in information over time. So as we look at time series models, we're looking at patterns over time. And we can have different types of patterns. So a level pattern is just a horizontal pattern in a time series. Okay, so basically no change in the data. Okay, what we saw in the past is what we'll see in the future, no change. Now we can see a trend. This is a persistent upward or downward pattern. So over time, the forecast, if we're forecasting demand for our product, it's either going up or it's going down. Now you don't just have to be forecasting the quantity demanded of your good or service. You can forecast other things, like the number of complaints you're going to experience. You could look at past quality issues, so number of defects, and you could forecast forward that as well. So it doesn't have to be just the amount you're producing, although a lot of our strategic and operations decisions are based on the amount we make. So that's commonly what we look at with forecasting. Seasonality is a wave-like pattern. So wave-like variation, and seasonality is related to the calendar. So when we talk about seasonality, we're talking about variations that occur within a year. In comparison, a cycle is a wave-like pattern. And this is going to last more than 1 year. So cycles, we think about things like business cycles. We could have periods of growth and then contraction, and it can span multiple years. So that peak that you see might take a number of years before we're back up to that peak. With seasonality, that peak is reached within 1 year's time. So for example, if we sell ice cream, then peak demand is the middle of summer, and then we see that peak demand again next summer. So we complete that whole wave-like variation within a year. All right, we also have irregular variation. Irregular variation is when data is caused by some kind of unusual one-time event. So there was just this perfect storm, this weird combination of events that caused this one-time change in our data. So it's a bit of an anomaly. It's not typical behavior. When we have irregular variations, first thing we need to do is figure out what caused them, why did they occur, and then whether or not they should even be considered in our future forecast. So because they are unusual one-time events, we typically want to remove them from the data so it doesn't skew our future forecast, because we're unlikely to see that extreme in the future. And then we have random variation. Random variation is just the residual variation after everything else has been accounted for. So this is really just the random noise. So some of the changes in your data as you're trying to forecast forward will just be random noise. And to deal with the random variation, we just make sure that we have enough data points, that we have a big enough sample size. If we're forecasting into the future, that we've gone far enough back in time. That'll give us enough data that we can, the random noise cancels each other out. We do want to make sure that as we're forecasting forward, that we've identified any trends, seasonality, or cycles, and to make sure that that is what we project forward into our forecast. And of course, the irregular variations, we want to make sure we don't include them so they don't skew the results. So let's see if we can identify some of these patterns. All right, so here's the 10-year crude oil prices. And what you can see here is a general upward trend from 2008 to 2014. And then we saw a very much downward trend that's continued on for a number of years. So we can look for trends over time, that progressive upward or downward movement. All right, here we have beer and wine sales. And what do you notice about the pattern that you're seeing here? Well, you should notice the wave. So when we talk about wave-like variations, is it seasonality or is it a cycle? Well, for these, notice how the peak and the trough are happening each year. So with beer, when are there the most sales of beer? Well, we buy the most beer in the summer. So the peak is in the summer and the trough is in the winter. Well, what about the sales of wine? It's the complete opposite. We buy more wine in the winter and the least amount of wine in the summer. And so in both of these cases, you have seasonality. Whenever you have seasonality, we want to make sure we identify that seasonality. We want to do what's called deseasonalize. That is, we want to take out that wave-like pattern so that we can see what the general trend is. And then once we forecast that general trend forward, then we can add back in the seasonality and say, okay, well, here's the general long-term forecast. And now based on the time of year, we can add a bit or subtract a bit depending on if it's near that peak or trough. So that's how you deal with seasonality. You take out the seasonality, you deseasonalize, you forecast the trend forward, and then you add the seasonality back. This graph shows the unemployment rate back to the 20s. Notice this big spike here. when the unemployment rate hit close to 20% in the 30s. That was the Great Depression. What kind of pattern is that? Well, that's that irregular variation. We've never had that level of unemployment since. It was an unusual one-time event. So if you were forecasting the unemployment rate for the future, would you want to include those numbers in your data set? Well, the problem is if you include those high numbers when everything else is much smaller, your forecast will be skewed upward and it'll have a much larger error. So we want to remove that irregular variation. We can also see a wave-like pattern here. Notice that wave-like pattern goes across multiple years. So it's what type of pattern? It's a cycle. And what you're seeing there is a business cycle.